I wasn't here yesterday, so I listened really eagerly with what you talked about, Rosemary. So I fear that I'm going to cover some of the same ground, but I'll just start with where I was going to start anyway. I mean, talking to this crowd here, I don't think it comes to a surprise of anyone that the energy sector is undergoing just a massive transformation at the moment. That's coming from all angles. We've talked earlier about government policy, changing consumer preferences, what's going on in terms of increased engagement from customers, and then obviously changes in technology driving that change in the mix. Now these changes are not unique to Australia, but what is particularly prominent here is the pace of change and the fact that it's all going on. So what I wanted to talk today is sort of at the macro level, what do we see as the three key changes going on? What does that boil down to, and how we think that's sort of playing out in the reliability space? And then come back to sort of the micro, how that's impacting on us doing our job, and how we see that playing out in the market. So the three changes really boil down to three things. One, changing supply side. What are we seeing? We're seeing increased variable renewable energy coming on. That's come on the back, as you say, of government policy as well initially, but really has been driven now just that decrease in costs and consumer sentiment that's coming both in terms of and at the utility scale as well as at the household level. We're seeing increased distributed energy resources as part of that as well. And then on the other side, you're seeing the decline and the retirement or impending retirement, a lot of those larger synchronous generating units, typically coal. We're seeing, second piece, the changing demand side, increased two-way flows, increased engagement from customers, a lot of behind-the-meter activity rising. We've currently got 1.8 million units in terms of household units at the moment. That's set to grow substantially over the next few years. What does that mean when currently we don't see the visibility of that activity? From us as an operating perspective, has quite considerable impacts on the grid. And I'm getting some smiles from the crowd because I know that we've talked about this before as well and how we can actually change that, so I look forward to the questions. The reduction in heavy manufacturing, and I'm preaching to the choir here in terms of what sort of impact that's had from an affordability angle in terms of what's going on from an energy perspective. And then on the other side, you're seeing increased air conditioning load, and combined that whole change together, you're seeing much sharper peaks in terms of what's going on as you're seeing the solar uptake during the day and then challenging in terms of coming into those evening peaks. So the demand profile looks quite different for us at the moment. The third key change at a macro level we're seeing is the weather. So information that we're getting from the BOM really reinforces what we're seeing operationally. We're seeing increased and longer extreme weather patterns. Higher temperatures, particularly relevant in some states and particularly relevant over those sort of tricky summer periods. That not only has impacts in terms of on the demand side, in terms of what people are looking to. We all go home, want to turn on our aircon, we all want to make sure that we'll stay comfortable and the wine stays cold, etc. That has increased pressures on our, from a resiliency perspective. It has increased pressures on generating resources and increased pressure on our network resources. So in terms of the challenge that presents for our infrastructure is increasing at the same time. And then wrapping it all around those three things, we're now importing weather as a fuel source, for a much growing perspective, for a growing number of our supply mix. So the chaos, so to speak, that you see going on, particularly in those sort of new and difficult and extreme weather days, can lead to some quite challenging operational conditions for us, not only from a forecasting perspective, but in terms of an operating perspective. So that's sort of what we're seeing at the macro level. So to bring that down to the micro and sort of how those combined changes are impacting on how we operate the system, I guess collectively we see, and I agree with the points Claire made earlier, but I think from an operating perspective, it's a little bit more integrated. We see the issues of reliability and security as being increasingly integrated, and so the actions we're taking for one really impact on the other, sort of on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's really important to look at the issues holistically. So I like what Claire said in terms of saying, while the NEG is looking at one piece of it, it really does need to be looked at collectively to make sure that we're getting the design changes as a market to make sure that we can deliver those outcomes going forward. What does that mean? What are the changes we're seeing from an operating perspective? Well, that's increasing the variability of output on the grid. We're seeing increased and increased unpredictability on the system. If you think about it, on some of those very, very challenging days, typically our ability to carry out reliable forecasting activities already, can often be a challenging role, I'll be honest. But short-term, that impacts on our ability to do short-term forecasting as well as long-term to support our planning activities. The traditional methods and approaches that we've taken to develop those forecasts and reserves is no longer really suiting this changing environment. This is then challenging for us in terms of what do we need on the system for a given day to make sure that we can manage that variability in output you're seeing on the resources, that variability in demand, what you're seeing, and then the variability of weather under those difficult conditions. That is increased uncertainty. We need to carry higher reserves for those activities. This all comes through in terms of impact on customers. So the short term, what does this mean? This means that we're having to take increased interventions in the market. While these are necessary actions to ensure that we can maintain and secure a reliable system, the interventions are unlikely to deliver optimal market outcomes. The fact that we're needing to intervene on an increased basis also points to a need for different tools and market constructs to ensure that we're valuing the full range of resources and capabilities available on the grid. The NEM is now operating with a much more diverse set of resources than when it first was put in place. There's a different cost profile, there's different time periods in which decisions need to be made to affect changes to operations, particularly if you're trying to bring in resources like demand-side response and batteries. Some of the operating decisions they need to be able to make to participate in the short term, they need to make those decisions a bit further out. So we need constructs to be able to support that. With a longer term lens, this is where a more holistic approach to integrated system planning will enable better outcomes for both the market and consumers. Incentives to steers to enable investments that will better optimise assets and resources to deliver security and reliability across the integrated NEM. These changes are starting. The work that we've carried out with ARENA over the past year to get in place a range of demand-side providers is enabling us to test out new and different supply sources and to gain insights on how a strategic reserve could be developed. We think this is an important step, but we also need to look wider and see what changes to market design are needed to really optimise the full range of resources and engage this increasingly active price-responsive demand. I think the really interesting thing about demand-side response here in Australia is that it's often viewed as the supplier of last resort, where demand needs to be protected at all costs, and I think that's a discussion worth having. I think in an environment where energy affordability continues to be a real challenge, it is incumbent on us to look, as a sector, to look at it differently and look at how we can change aspects of the market that may currently be acting as a barrier to engage price-responsive customers that may prefer to offer their load into the market earlier in the price stack instead of being switched off as load shedding. So where we're now seeing much more engagement with customers, an increase in aggregators and an increase in customers getting PV and batteries, these resources can be exceptionally valuable in supporting security and reliability, and we really welcome that to broaden that supply mix. So we need to be able to optimise the full range of dispatchable... Oh, I got bound. We need to be able to optimise the full range of dispatchable resources available to deliver optimal outcomes for customers. And we need market constructs ahead of time so that we know what is available and committed, and so that participants can signal their availability and their ability to provide services, which is particularly relevant for demand-side resources who need that time to plan their operations. So just bring that together, I think we just need to go back to basics. What is the outcome and overall objective? And it really needs to be to reduce the overall retail bill while at the same time maintaining security and reliability of supplies and meeting on our carbon reduction commitments. And so we welcome opportunities to engage in that discussion.